Delighted to be joined this morning by McKenna Sweazey. Thank you for being here. We're just about 15 minutes away from each other, aren't we?
Yes.
In the Valley, but we're meeting over Zoom because we've all got back-to-back schedules. And we're going to be discussing how to communicate with, motivate, and coach your teams in a hybrid world. We're going to be discussing some real-life examples of effective remote working practices. And we're going to be talking about ways to create a people-first workplace and culture that promotes inclusivity and collaboration. So, McKenna, before we dive in, and as folks continue to trickle in to the webinar, it'd be great to hear on the chat where people are from. We'll be taking some time for questions towards the end of our session as well. So in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll be looking to have some questions, but we're going to have a great deal of fun today. McKenna and I, we're talking about this on Tuesday, and there's some really, really great topics as well coming up that I'm excited to dive into. But before we start, McKenna, where are you? What are you up to? You've recently written something, which we'd love to hear about. Well, written a lot of things, written a great book we'd love to hear about. But yeah, what are you up to? What are you passionate about? And where are you?
Yeah. So I'm in Silicon Valley. And as you mentioned, I just had my book come out. It's called How to Win Friends and Manage Remotely. This is a bit of a passion project that I thought I was going to write this book, and then the pandemic hit, and I thought, oh, this book actually kind of writes itself. I'd been managing and being managed in what I guess we would call hybrid now, but of course at the time it just was a global role for years. Out of London, and working with teams and around the world, and going into the office sort of on a mixed schedule. So it came pretty easily to think, what is this going to look like, post-pandemic? I never really believed that we would never go back to the office. I love going into the office, but obviously the world's changed dramatically. So anyways, so the book is really like 3 parts. And one is like, what do you have to do for yourself to make sure that you can use, and what I like to call digital empathy, which I will define in a moment, to get along better, to understand better what your teammates are thinking, the people that report to, your boss, and to be able to use that information. So how do you set yourself up for success? How do you then manage well? And I go through some really specific examples, like if you unfortunately have to let someone go, or at least manage their performance pretty seriously. Team building, which I think, is everyone's favorite hybrid question. Knowledge dissemination, which is, everyone, it's like the key to good hybrid and virtual work is being able to understand where the knowledge is and who's where doing what. And then obviously the getting to know people, networking, getting hired for a new job. So really practical chapters, I'd like to think. And I will define digital empathy because I know Dan's been waiting for me to spell this one out. And actually I have it written down because I always get it wrong, even though it's my thing. It's the ability to understand the feeling or share the feelings of another virtually. And an important part of this definition for me, there's 3 types of empathy: cognitive, sympathetic, and the one that I never deal with that I'm forgetting. I'm blanking. Sorry, guys. But anyways, I'm talking about cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is the understanding of someone else's feelings. It's not necessarily catching those feelings, nor is it trying to do something about them. That would be sympathetic empathy, but understanding them. And I think, for those of you who've read Kim Scott's book, which deals with ruinous empathy, this is really that idea that you don't want someone else's feelings to derail you or to derail a project, but you want to know that people are entitled to their feelings, and mitigating them and working with other people's feelings is hugely important. Even if, I take Dan off a project and he's mad about it, I need to react to that. And particularly when I only have a few digital cues about why he's mad about that. But it doesn't mean I shouldn't take him off the project. If he doesn't need to be on the project, he doesn't need to be on the project. So that's digital empathy and my book. It was a long-winded explanation.
Cool. I love that. It's super interesting. And for those just joining, my name's Dan. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Cadence. We build tools for companies that are moving to hybrid working. Super interesting. Obviously, the definition of digital, right, is 0 or 1. It's binary. It's something's either on or it's off. It's very black and white in terms of just the technical definition of of digital. And then analog being the opposite of that, it's everything in between. It's a wave motion rather than a straight up or down motion. How different do you think empathy can be? There are different ways we can do that digitally versus in person. Do we pick up on different cues from people online versus in person?
I mean, night and day. And actually, this is a good example of what I can see of your body right now. Everyone sits at their home office in a different way. And particularly if you are sitting in different environments, like you go to a cafe and it's a laptop versus sitting at home where you maybe have a camera and a microphone and whatever. If you're sitting, let's say in a cafe, I can see maybe, and I don't know if this is going to come through, but bear with me. You can only see a little bit around my face. And that's a tiny portion of what I'm giving forward. The way you're sitting now is actually pretty great. I can see your shoulders. Shoulders are hugely important for saying what we're feeling. I can tell because obviously you're English. You don't use a lot of hand gestures. But if you did, I would be able to see them. Some things we can still pick up. The human voice is incredibly rich. And I think one of the pandemic moves to so many video calls is actually a negative. It gives the impression of presence and the impression that we're trying to understand what each other is thinking and doing, but it actually isn't giving that many more cues than voice, particularly with bandwidth. You can't see micro expressions. You can't see multiple people's faces at once in the same way that you can in an in-person environment. So something like the phone is really rich, and humans are designed to pick up on each other's vocal changes to understand emotions. But that being said, humans are also pretty adept at picking it up from, say, text. Everyone knows that Facebook influences your emotions. They've done lots of studies on that. It can make you happy or sad, depending on what you see in the news feed. So that's all to say, we're definitely still getting emotional information from each other. It's not as rich and It's different. And being able to use it, we have how many, I'm terrible at, I don't even know what study this would be, but how many thousands upon thousands of years of practice as humans reading each other's body language, tone of voice, facial expression. And now you're asking me to use those exact same skills on a tiny little screen. And that's going to take some effort for people to get to the same level of ability.
Yeah. I've been reading this amazing book called The Life We All Want by a guy called Andy Crouch, which talks about the effect of technology on our day-to-day lives. And here's this really interesting, a number of interesting things in the book. One of the interesting things as a parent is that he basically says that children are wired to recognize the face of other humans, and that there's been studies done on if you put a dog in front of a newborn baby, their eyes, their attention is not drawn towards it, for example. But if you put a human face in front of a baby, their eyes are drawn towards it. They know what to do and they instinctively follow. And it goes on to talk about how, if we throw an iPad to our children, for example, if they're upset, then it's teach them to get to be comforted by a screen, for example. So like all these sorts of things that we all struggle with as parents. And then he goes on to talk about this really interesting thing called devices versus instruments. And it's this idea of with devices, the kind of promise is that humans can do less work. You can be, the burden of work is taken from you with a device. Whereas but the cost to that is that humans are taken out of the loop. So a washing machine might be a device, a dishwasher might be a device. You're taken out of the loop, but you're relieved of burden. On the other hand, instruments are where humans are in the loop, and it amplifies the human's performance. It amplifies the human's creativity. You become more human using it, a piano, for example, or a bicycle or something. So anyway, it's a really interesting piece. And I just wonder so two things on that, kind of what empathy, kind of what are we trained to pick up on? I mean, where do you recommend to your clients and where you're researching, if somebody does have that struggle with that boss or with that person, are you seeing, something we're discussing live at Cadence, who do those people go to in a digital remote context? And perhaps let's start with that kind of, we're trained to look for people's faces, but if all we've got is a list of Slack DMs to go to if something comes up? Where should people go? What should people do?
So I think the basis of this, and the same with the kids and the monkeys and the dogs, is that it's pattern recognition. And the only thing you have to go on in many of these scenarios is a change. That is not usually how they email me. And how far of a change is it? Let's just use email because it's just such a low in richness, low in emotional cues platform. So if you're getting emails that is a major change, how big a change is this? And at what point do I need to ask, is everything okay? And I think something that managers and leadership can do is and it is hard because it feels like a waste of time. Remote work tends to feel like more efficient, more optimized. And that moment of sharing at the beginning of a call, or just how your day is gone, or just an emoji of the day, can be really helpful. In the office, if I spill a cup of coffee in front of me and then I'm like, oh, Dan, hand me the stapler. You know why I'm saying that in a snotty voice, because I have just spilled a cup of coffee in front of me, and so many other cues, and any way that we can give those cues. And I think you have to normalize starting a call with a little bit of, this is where I'm at today. So that you start to build on that information, because it is pattern recognition. When they're in bad mood, this is how they write emails. When they're not in a bad mood, this is how they write emails. And then also asking, and this
can I on that one very quickly, how big does that work? I mean, I can't pattern recognize in a team of 1,000 people necessarily. If I'm so I can't, I can tell the subtleties in my team. This morning, for example, it's the end of the month, so sales is critical. I know that one of my key team members is moving at the weekend, so I can tell in the chat, right? But I'm filled with that context. I remember a couple of years ago, I was like, where is this guy? It's the end of the month. Where is he? It turns out that his wife's ex-husband had just died, and he was dealing with the kids. There was context that I was missing from that I would have had if he had gone from the office that day, midday, got the call, and ran off. But how do people do that? Are you recommending smaller teams? How do we find that? Because I'm quite short on the whole add an emoji with how you're doing thing. I'm quite short on that. If I'm being honest.
When it only works in a small team, things like that, like this is not a massive thing. But why do you need to know how 1,000 people are feeling? That's well beyond the capability of the human brain, and not useful. Let's just say that Cadence in a few years' time is 1,000-person organization. It is on everyone to get used to your moods because you're the CEO. But you are just working with the team that you manage. And I don't think that finding a rhythm for understanding how everyone is doing that day is beyond the realm. And maybe it's not every day. Or maybe it's training people. And I think this is helpful, but it's hard if you don't have psychological safety. And that comes down to are you doing enough team building? Are you finding each other in person so that you feel very comfortable to say, I'm having a terrible day today.
One of my favorite definitions of team is from Coach Wooden, the famous college basketball coach. She says, team is people that you're certain of. And I just love that. People that you're certain of, that you've had that relationship and that trust. I mean, we were talking the other day and we were giggling about this. We had a team offsite 2 weeks ago or last week in Northern Ireland, flew the entire team in from the US, from Europe, from England to Northern Ireland. And one of our engineers slacked me afterwards and said, that was a really intimate time we had together. And he loved it. And there's not something you would imagine most engineers saying to you, that was an intimate time, know, to generalize an engineer stereotype here. But they took a ton out of it. The team was hyper energized afterwards. And we built a shared bank of memories together that we can go on and laugh and giggle about in the future, and that kind of shared trust. So those moments of building that rapport are super key. I mean, we do it at the top of meetings now on Zoom every time. It's it's typical stuff, weather, kids, blah, blah, blah. But
That's dropping an emoji. Why are you short on dropping an emoji? You're dropping a verbal emoji.
that's true. All right. All right. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I don't know why that's different for me.
You're just
There's
not
more,
emoji first. What can I say?
there's more fidelity in asking those questions, I would say, than there is in
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it only works if you're on a Zoom call.
yeah,
And if you are off a Zoom call and you're asynchronous,
yeah,
I mean, asynchronous work is less emotional.
yeah,
And then I think if that's what you're talking about and you're working and let's say your entire work flow is on Asana and that's the interaction, right? Completely asynchronous. Then I think it does come down to training and going through messages and saying, you know what, guys, this is a message, not people's actual examples, that comes off as passive aggressive. This is how we format a request. These are phrases that come off as rude. Think about what the person's hearing. Think about the ultimate goal of your message. I think about this all the time when we talked about this a bit, that document commenting etiquette is like my personal pet, one of my top 3 bet noirs. And because I think people don't write document comments to get you to have the best often to get you to have the best presentation that you're going to have. They write it to show they've seen it. They write it to show other people they've seen it. They write it to prove that they are more aware of how the sales numbers look that quarter. And should you put the slides in a different order? This is also the fault of documenting software where you do it slide by slide. It doesn't start with like what was your overall thought of this presentation, A, B, or C? So things like that, just really being formulaic for the tools you use and saying, this is what polite effort that gets things done. The goal is to get things done. It's not to make everyone happy.
Well, that's key, right? And this let's answer this question from the anonymous attendee here that's come through, because I think that this matters different. I think that this comes across differently for different personality types. So, what's the best way to address and cater for different personality types or employees from different generations when communicating remotely? A non-work example would have been what my wife and I got an email yesterday from somebody. And it came across a little bit cold, the email that we got on a home matter, and I said I think she's just being factual. And so I responded with quite a factual response, and then put at the end, "Have a great evening." And then my wife was like, "Are you responded in a cold way too?" And I was like, "Well, I think it was just a factual exchange." And from a personality type perspective, I'm an INFP in Myers-Briggs speak. And I am much better at being spoken to in different ways. You know, if I'm encouraged, I'm going to really like you and I'm going to open up more, and et cetera, et cetera. And as a company, we've benefited from going through a program called Giant, which is helping understanding everybody's voice orders and Enneagram and Myers-Briggs types rather. We found that incredibly helpful for understanding how to get the best out of people, not just out, but how to get the best into folks. Well, what are you seeing in terms of, you know, Enneagrams, MBTIs, discs? Like, how is that all informing this period of time?
Those are my favorite team building things, not because I think any one of them is better or more interesting, but because they are sort of like how a framework for emotional intimacy that allows you to say that actually this is a business thing, but what you're saying is this is who I am at the core of my being, which is very hard for a lot of people to either do comfortably or accurately. And so very helpful to have any framework that teaches you to say, this is who I am and this is how I communicate. Then it goes back to, then I have a pattern. Dan's told me that he's an INFP. I don't remember what you said.
The best one.
The ENTJ, the Napoleon. And have you seen the website where they tell you what dog you are based on your Myers-Briggs?
No,
I
want
with that later.
Now, but I'm hosting a webinar, so I probably shouldn't. But yeah,
exactly. Not the time to Google that, but it's now you can't help it. You'll be thinking about it the whole time. Anyways, so that clarity is hugely important. and using tools like that to have that framework. And it's a little bit like the team building, it's the same memories that you can jointly come back to and say, oh, well, you're doing that because you're an I, and I'm doing this because I'm an E. And I'm sure you have, and I've definitely heard that in the office before. It gives you language to explain emotions, which is hard for a lot of people, depending on their, how they react to these things. So I think that is important. Again, the occasional in-person context, I think, is very important, because all of this is about building more context for reacting to people. The generation one, I have there's been a lot of chat about how Gen Z uses emojis differently. And if there's anyone from Gen Z, I mean, if you can't take a smiley face at face value in the workplace because that's like out of your generation, that's on you. It's not on the person who used a smiley face, winky face. You know what? We should just agree. Those mean what they mean, and don't take them out of context. If somebody sends the cowboy guy, sure, right. That's like replying in French to an English email. That's on them. And feel free to respond with, what on God's earth do you mean by that?
My favorite one is the new salute one. That's my new favorite one. The new one.
Yeah, but that just means aye, Captain. That's very clear, right?
Yeah.
Right. Or what do you think it means?
I think it means let's go. And I've got that understood. Yeah.
Aye, Captain, right? We're kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Like affirmative assent.
Yeah. And again, with the generational piece, so one of my family members is a partner at a large firm, and a bunch of their older employees are really quite enjoying being remote. They've got their networks, they've got their garden offices, they've got their client list, but their associates are really missing the going in. And this guy was saying to me that he would have hated it as an associate in his early 20s, not being able to go in and learn from this person that he'd been trying to get a job for or with for the last 2 years coming out of university. How do you, and it's different, right? Often you hear it the other way around. You hear, older generations want to have people in because that's the way they've always worked. But there's so many blends of gray or shades of gray in all of this that not only apply to your personality type, it applies to where you are. I was doing a podcast yesterday talking about the differences of hybrid in Silicon Valley versus hybrid in London and New York. Hybrid in Silicon Valley is really hard because it's an hour long in terms of geography. It's an hour for you and I to get to the city, for example. And I'm going up for 2 meetings today after this, and it is a pain.
And it's not fun because there's nothing going on in San Francisco, as opposed to New York or London, where you're like, yes, there's a great coffee coming my way.
Well, I've got a nice lunch coming, hopefully. But anyway, whereas in London you get on the tube and it's largely 10 to 20 minutes, or depending on where you are.
Oh, Dan, I'm not with you on this argument.
Come on, tell me.
No, I mean, you live in Queens. It's definitely an hour into the city. That being said, I think that's so short-sighted by someone to say, is particularly, let's just say, because I've heard this from some people in professional services, let's say it's a consultant. Good for them that they want to stay home. I know how that workflow works, and you have a lot of work coming out of associates. And I think, there've been lots of investment banking chat that investment banking training will now take an extra year because the learning by osmosis isn't happening as quickly. So that's great. That's saying I want to do something that gives me pleasure that isn't good for the bottom line. And either we rejigger society for that, or we're going to get to a reckoning where you say, well, I'm not getting as much out of my associates. And if I want to continue in a corporate world and make money, I'm going back in. I just feel very strongly that hybrid and like a pretty, maybe even 60-40, definitely 40-60 is the way forward. And again, it's role dependent. Professional services tends to be very interface oriented. There are types of engineering roles. There are types of graphic design. You may never have to go in again. And if that makes you happy, great. But you get paid to do your job. And if your job involves training associates.
Yeah. one of the investors in Cadence is a guy called Nick Bloom, who heads up the future of work practice at Stanford. Who's come out with some amazing research, I think on trip.com and their team. And he's now sat on data that shows that there's 15% more innovation that takes place when people meet face to face. But at the same time, there is 35% less resignations that happen when people have the ability to work remotely as part of their kind of hybrid diet. So kind of both are true, right? And what we're seeing and what we're recommending, our customer experience teams recommending to our customers, is come in for those heads up, whiteboard, collaboration, ideation times. And once you've done that, go away with your to-do list and execute at home. Obviously it's different for everybody. If you've got a younger person perhaps that doesn't have a spare room at home and they need to get out and be in a place, or the parent that has got a kid at home and needs to get out and be in a place, or whatever it might be. But what are you seeing that happen as well, that kind of heads up face-to-face creative time and then going away to execute?
Yeah. And I think this is when we've both seen this, because I just moved back from London just 2 years ago, and my friends there are going to the office a lot more than my friends in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And there's two things. I would say it sounds like more fun, which is just my bias, right? I'll just tell you, I'm an ENTJ. I love going to the office, and I'm the distracting woman that is everyone else is annoyed by, gossiping by the water cooler. But I think that, sorry, I lost my train of thought thinking about how much fun and how I missed the water cooler.
We were talking about heads up creative time.
Oh, heads up creative. Exactly. And I mean, I completely agree that, being able to say we schedule this time to do work. When I think about that resignation stat, though, as I think you are also trained to do. So what was the benchmark? How much resignation were we looking at before? Because resignation is natural. And if your job is only tolerable because you can do it from home, and as we know, there is not everyone by any means, but there's an allowance for slacking at home that you can, get into a position where you're doing far less. I think in a lot of those experiments, they were like pretty clear on the metrics, like the output metrics. But I don't know that no resignation is my ultimate goal. Again, it depends on the benchmark. Is it 35% a year, or is it 35% more? Whatever.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And how much of all of this is the responsibility of the employee just to figure out where and when and with who to place themselves, and the company to kind of put in place? And I think the same could be true of effective comms digitally as well, right?
Yeah.
Is Slack asynchronous, or is Slack synchronous, or Teams synchronous? How much of all of this is on the company versus the employee to figure out?
For me, it's 90-10, the company, maybe 80-10. Depending, obviously, I've been at startups where the bandwidth maybe didn't allow you to spend that much time thinking about comms. But that being said, and we were joking about this, then it just comes down to the CEO saying something and meaning it. Slack is asynchronous, guys. You never think about it again. We just agree. It's easier, frankly, to do something offhand and agree to it than it is to be sort of murky and find your way. Because Slack, how you behave in Slack or Teams is culture now. That is the culture. It's what time people arrive at work. It's how chatty it is. It's how informal it is. Are we the kind of place where we send gifts that are a little weird, or we're not? So and I think, many management experts would say either you are specific about your culture and it helps you, or you're not specific about your culture and it can really, really hinder you. So I think it's on the company. That being said, obviously, if you're trying to do really well and you're that associate, you're going to hustle to find a way to supersede what you've been given. But not everyone, again, the first question of, different personality types. If you're super empathetic naturally, it can be easy to read people. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book. Like we know there are ways to train yourself to be better at empathy. Like reading fiction is a really good way to be better at empathy. It helps you get inside the minds of other people. Giving up social media is a good way to get better at empathy. It helps you to read facial expressions better. And so you can do better, but if you're trying to account for all different types of people and different spectrums of empathy and different types of roles, I think it's on the company to say, this is our culture. This is what we expect. This is how we behave. And this is how we have a good time. Otherwise it's very boring and lonely.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. It's going to be really interesting to see as well how this changes as well with the economy. If we were doing this great big hybrid experiment in a bull economy, right, where there was tons and tons of job openings still, and I know it's very different between Europe and the US right now on that front. But for the most part,
budget for team building, flying everyone to Vegas,
Well, exactly. And so, I was doing this podcast yesterday, and we were talking about exactly this challenge of, the future of work would have looked very different, could look very different in a bull market versus a bear market, which is where we are largely now for the moment, particularly in growth companies. And therefore, there's going to be a lot more focus on outcomes and performance again, not just on perhaps qualitative measurement. There's going to be a lot more focus on the quantitative measurements. How do you think that is going to influence this kind of first chapter of hybrid, this kind of focus back on output again? Is it going to put us back into the kind of dark days of the pandemic where we're all just working far too hard at home? How do you think the macroeconomy is going to affect this kind of chapter of hybrid?
So here's my massive biased answer. And that now we've discussed our Myers-Briggs, that my bias is going in this direction. And I remember having this fight at the beginning of the pandemic, particularly when we're talking about sales. Everyone is aware that sales works better every salesperson would tell you they're better at selling in person and they enjoy it more and they close more.
We're going to be announcing a round of fundraising shortly, and the amount of people that I met face to face that said yes versus the amount of people that said no when met remotely, huge
difference. Yeah. And so I've always thought that a recession would push us towards that bias, sales is the revenue engine that drives most companies. And secondly, the bias of proximity, which is if your boss can see your face, you are less likely to be the one that gets fired. And as much as we can try to change that using structures and being really thoughtful and using metrics to measure output, it is also unlikely that humans will be able to overwrite every part of who they are. And so obviously output is really important. And if you can measure it, you're going to use that as your first metric of, who's important to my output in this business. But sitting next to your boss doesn't hurt. And I wonder if we will. And again, I don't think this means back in the office every day, but do I think, if you have optional Tuesdays, I think if the boss goes in on Tuesdays, everyone's going in on Tuesdays.
Yeah, we see this happening on Cadence. So on Cadence, you can follow different employees, and you can obviously, if they're part of your team, you can follow them and kind of obviously consensually.
I was going to say, does this allow for office romance?
That might be an ROI we haven't done a case study on yet. But and so we do find people organizing themselves around each other rather than just coming in on the day that is set.
Absolutely.
Which I think is really, really important. Fascinating. I am one of the questions here that I wanted to kind of get to on this, and particularly this is from Selma. I'm work from home with my company. It's 100% remote now. How can I manage miscommunication? And I think I just want to tag on to that, segueing back to this last point. How can that person also make sure that they are going to be in line for that promotion versus the person that's sat next to their boss?
So I just wrote a blog post on that second part. I think that the miscommunication is, there's so many times in which that can happen. So it's kind of hard to even begin to dive into that. That being said, having frameworks for the way that you communicate information, like the who, what, where, when, why is like a basic, obvious one, because it's missing information that is often an issue. I think this is true with like meeting agendas, being more transparent, and saying why someone's invited versus why they're not. That when you're not in person, people tend to get fallen off meetings because, I haven't talked to Jimmy in a while, and so I forgot to invite him.
Well, it's true. There are those people that look through other people's calendars and go, "Oh, I'm not on that one. What does that mean?"
Yeah, there are those people, lots of people.
Yeah, lots of people.
And the clearer you are, and of course, all this takes work, though. It's an extra bandwidth, unfortunately, is to write out what the point of the meeting is, so that Jimmy can either be like, "Hey, Dan, I really should be in that meeting," or, "Oh, I can see they're actually just talking about the like email effort, and really doesn't matter for my sales part."
Yeah.
So I think that transparency. 2, asking clarifying questions and practicing or nailing as a team, and this is a culture thing, the way to phrase a clarifying question that is not passive aggressive. Often reflecting back is the best way to do this. What I'm hearing is you want to do XYZ, or sort of future focused is the ideal output of this XYZ thing, that this other thing will happen. Getting someone
responsibility both on the hearer of that as well as the sender. I was like, if I'm not in a good headspace, the amount of times I've read an email out, I've been upset by an email from whatever, and I've read it to my wife that evening, and I'm like, oh, that's not actually saying what I thought it said originally. I think the responsibility is on the hearer as well, right? And how much, but that's something that society, we don't think about. It's my responsibility how I receive what's been said.
The only person you can control is yourself. 100%, 1,000,000,000%, I agree. And I think that I think the other way to start with is assuming they mean this in the best possible way, the most helpful, the most forward thinking, and anything else is just an aberration and has nothing to do with you. That I basically need a Post-it on my desk that says that. So I think being able, and again, saying as a team, and this is that 90-10 as a company, saying we celebrate clarifying questions. We celebrate using a framework to explain what we're asking for, different ways. We're long email people, we're short email people, we're TLDR people. So that, I tend to write long-winded emails. I really need a TLDR. But I like to over communicate, because I do know that so much of what I'm trying to explain can get lost because I want to go quickly and I have to overdo it. We're all trying to fight our own flaws. So I think that being able to go back and ask again, and having the culture, building this into the culture, we are trying to do better because this is new and different. It is not the same to only email and to never sit next to someone, not never, but quite less frequently.
I'm going to quote Andy Crouch again, who I quoted earlier. He said the question is not how to make toil easier and make leisure abundant. It's how to make good hard things possible, because good work is a good hard thing. So the question is not how to make toil easier, how to make work easier and leisure more abundant. It's how to make good hard things possible, because good work is a good hard thing. So much of all of this comes down to how people view work, right? Do people view work as their life's calling and part of their life's narrative, or do they see it as a paycheck to look after the family and to get back to what they really want to be doing, which might be, ABC? So much comes down to that. I remember we were having a discussion internally, and you'll probably kill me for this, McKenna. We were having a discussion internally about experimenting with 4-day versus 5-day working weeks, and we're on 5 days. And I was like, there is no way we're gonna do 4 days. If I'd like there to be 10 days in a week. And I said, can you imagine saying to Cristiano Ronaldo or to any other elite sports person, you can only work 4 days in a week, you can't work 6 days or whatever it might be and train. Like their life's mission is to be the best soccer football player on the planet. Now you can make arguments for being better in those 4 days, etc. And I'm fully aware of that. And I think much of that's valid, but so much of this whole thing comes down to, are we here to do really, really, really great work, the business thrive, and because the business is thriving, I'm going to thrive personally? Or are we just here to take a paycheck? Because so much of that is going to drive how we come to hybrid and remote and what we think about.
Absolutely. And now I will quote Malcolm Gladwell, who said, if you are fully remote, you are doing it just for the paycheck, because humans have always interacted. And this is in his estimation, not interaction. It feels like interaction. I feel like we're interacting.
Yeah.
So I'm not totally on board with that, but yeah, I think, and in every company, it will be different, and in every type of job. And maybe that is a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing to separate what people want, and how badly they want it. That seems like a merit-based system to me. And we may have a continuous reshuffling of what company is right for people based on that. I think now people choose companies to go work for based on a variety of things. And one of them was geography. And now it's going to be remote or not remote. And it gives the people a lot more choice if you have remote. And so maybe you can find a company that better aligns with how you want to spend your day. And I can think of, in a 4-day company with 3 days in the office, depending if it's the kind of role where you get more done in the office, maybe that is much better. Because we've all seen sales teams, like Fridays are kind of dead. Let's just acknowledge they're dead. And say, we're going to get way more done Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So, and again, that's back to the Ronaldo thing. Like that's a rest day, not a not working day. So I think I think we can't rush that. I think that will shake out what works for you and what works for you as a CEO. Am I getting enough from my team? And fortunately, we do have, or unfortunately, I mean, you can see how many emails people are sending a day, sort of on a gross level. You can use some output metrics to understand when is the productivity happening.
A large number of people are now presenting. They're doing team all hands calls. They're doing keynotes across offsites, perhaps even presenting to conferences remotely. And one of the questions from Tony here is, he likes to feed off, as many presenters do, feed off the room. And I'm sure you've been there like I have. You're laying out the mission statement or this quarter's goals, and it's just crickets from the call, right?
Yeah.
And you're looking at people's eyes. Are they looking up the top right? Are there new notifications just coming in? Are they looking at you? Did they put a thumbs up or a clap emoji on Zoom to celebrate that new objective that you just set for the team? Or did they put this, what advice would you give to presenters for people that are presenting in those types of environments?
So I think, I'd love Zoom, if anyone is ever listening to me at Zoom or Teams or wherever, to use a percentage function so that we have some number of people microphones on. It can't be everyone. That's like way too much noise, but the sound is very helpful. Coughing, laughing. Yeah. We're very used to those murmurs of assent that tell us you're listening, you're engaged, you're dealing with what I'm dealing. And it depends on the size of the room. Obviously, you'd really need to keep it small, even if it's 500 people. But if it's 5 people, everyone can keep their sound on. The screen is less helpful because it's harder for our eyes to process that many faces in that like limited space, and they're tiny and you're really not getting the right cues. So I don't feel so strongly about that. It also depends on the way you have your camera 2 screens set up, whether or not you can comfortably do that. I actually think another key thing is to think about what you're doing with the emojis and stuff in Zoom. I think those can be a big distraction. I'm trying to present And if an emoji pops up, then my eye goes there, my eye goes here. I'm looking over at Tony's question. It's on another screen. I don't think those are actually very useful during a presentation. And Slack is the same. Yeah, I think it's verbal in that sense. I think it has to be.
I like that. That's a really good feature idea. Really
No,
like that.
why don't they listen to my tweets?
Yeah. Oded, if you're on here, who's head of product at Zoom. Cool. There was a podcast, another question from Jenny Grant here. There was a podcast that interviewed the co-creator of The Office, and he was saying that offices are made up of very different types of people, and the only way you can know who to interface with is with different people and having those awkward conversations in person that you can learn from. And it kind of goes back to where are we placing ourselves? Are we placing ourselves for the benefit of our own day, or are we placing ourselves for the benefit of the whole of the corporate mission? And they can both be true, or they can both be opposites. What do you think about that?
I mean, I have to agree with the concept. I think it can be done digitally. I think if you're thoughtful about, Slack has that tool, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Coffee Donut, where you get, sent around the horn, meeting different people. But then you have people, and I think we've had questions that have like nodded to this, people who say that is not the office I'm in. I don't care. I'm not going. This is not my priority. I get in, I do my work, and I get out. And that is where I think we run into problems that the office makes it a little bit easier, because you're forced to see their, peculiarities, the way they take their coffee, whatever. If you're not willing to share, it makes it harder for people to work with you, to read your emotions, to know you're having a good day or a bad day, what makes you tick, what makes you happy, how can I get the most out of you in our work relationship. And I have to think, yeah,
that's so true. I at our offsite last week, I watched one of our team members put 4 or 5 cubes of sugar into their coffee. I was like, what on earth is, and it's a tiny coffee. I was like, what on earth? But osmosis, I picked up something from that about this individual that is actually going to inform how I communicate with him to a degree. It's not going to change everything, and maybe that's far too subjective of me and far too shallow of me. But it is going to change how I think about him and speak to him. Maybe that's really judgmental, but all these little cues have huge ramifications, because that might mean that because of the way I communicate with that person, that product gets shipped a week faster, which means that we land that customer, which means that investor gives a reference call to that customer, which means, and the whole thing butterflies. Maybe that's too much to say for, an extra cube of sugar going into a coffee.
No, I'm into it.
Okay, good. If McKenna's into it, we're okay. McKenna, we talked about, and you do some work as well in the metaverse too. Talk us through your experiences. I've got an Oculus over here. I rarely use it. I bought it with great gusto. I really like the idea, particularly for me with board members in Salt Lake City and in London and here. I really like the idea of doing higher fidelity board meetings in Zoom without having to pay for everybody, in Oculus, without having to pay for everybody to come to San Francisco or whatever all the time. And one of our board members said the other day, hey, I'm only doing in-person board meetings now because I'm finding that the amount of the throughput of data that they are able to get across and receive, they said in their words, it's 70% higher when you're in person, because they quoted saying, when I'm talking, I know that 2/3 of people are not listening. And when you're talking, I know that 2/3 of people are not. So that only means that X percentage of people are actually getting
listening at any one moment.
Is that true in the metaverse? Has any of that changed? Is it just higher fidelity communication? Is it going to catch on?
So I think until you have the camera on your face, which I know everyone is working very hard on, to be able to capture micro expressions and where your eyes are in that moment, I think that as a replacement, no. The one thing the Oculus and other technology of this has, which I am obsessed with, And again, if anyone is at Apple is listening to my remote work tips, one thing that's not great about being on a computer is that the sound all comes from one direction.
Yeah.
One, that's confusing for your brain. It uses bandwidth that you would rather be using for something else. Two, it just is not as effective in communication. If I see Judy standing to your left, Judy's voice should come from her left. And it helps keep a conversation going in the right way and turning your head, etc. So Oculus is capable of doing that, right? The sound can
Spatial
come.
audio. Yeah.
I think until we have, I don't think proximity, I think the falsification of proximity, implying you're close to each other in a room and that you can hear each other, I don't think that feels natural yet. Again, the facial expressions, I think we're a ways off. I do think it has a lot of amazing implications, but I think we're a couple of years away.
Okay. Interesting. And do you have any friends that are using it regularly? What's their experience of it?
Well, I have friends who are at Meta and they are using it regularly.
Okay.
And I think that they're dog fooding, right? And testing it out. It's still a pretty heavy piece of equipment. And you know, I won't speak for them. I don't think that this is, we're not, it's in process, right?
Yeah.
But did you watch the Netflix documentary of the guy who free solos?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a version of that on Oculus. And if you watch that, then you're like, yes, this actually is the best content that we'll ever have. This is amazing. It's terrifying. And after I had that experience, I thought, yeah, we're going in this direction. This is too cool. But I don't think work-wise, we're quite there yet.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, though, isn't it? Because there's the first game that I saw that I really wanted the other day that came across on Oculus was the new NFL quarterback game. And it puts you in the position of the quarterback where you're being thrown the ball and then you now have the opportunity to obviously deliver the pass. And I was like, that makes so much sense for this particular format of play. I don't have to move around a great deal. I can get the perspective of the quarterback, which is something that I've never really ever had. And I just thought that was a really, really good format for that game. But when I put it on for my kids, and my kids are going around shooting things or whatever, they are being taken out of, even though they might be doing it with other people, let's say on Oculus, they're being taken out of the room. And I'm actually wanting to, and I know I can AirPlay it and watch it on the TV if I wanted to, but they are being taken out of the room and they're going into this individual silo again to have said experience. And there's just so much there of like, technology promises us so much community, but what we're all longing for is richer community with others, which goes back to the baby point at the start of recognizing. Talking about gaming, and we've got 5 minutes left, if there are any questions coming in. As a teenager, I formed really close bonds with friends all over Europe, gaming. We used to play a game called Counter-Strike. I got paid a little bit of money to be in that world at one point, selling advertising for game servers. And I can still remember the names of the guys in Sweden that I used to play with. And sometimes you'd be staying out to 2, 3 a.m. Playing with these folks. You get to know people really, really well. What can we learn from gaming? Because I know that for kids in particular, Fortnite and other games during the pandemic were very much a social lifeline.
And I think there's no doubt that, this starts with Jane Austen, right? You can fall in love via letters. Humans are very capable, and that's not true for everyone. Some people are good writers and they're good at communicating things, or some people are not. So we are totally able to really connect with people on limited pieces of information. And Fortnite, etc., if you have a headset on, that's a pretty rich environment and you're experiencing things in real time together. So you're missing facial expressions, but you are having a shared experience. I think what the most interesting thing about the gaming is the sheer amount of time you are listening to each other, perceiving the same things. As you just said, you're up until 2 or 3 in the morning, playing a game, having this experience. You do not sit there poking away at your Excel with your headset on, sitting next to Judy in the office. And if you did, that would be like being in the office, because you'd be like, oh crap, I spilled my coffee. Oh, I got to mute because my mother-in-law is calling. And oh no, now she wants to do this annoying thing. It's that context. And quantity is important for context as well. If Myers-Briggs quality context, staying up until 2 a.m. with your head shut on is quantity context.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's humans will not be conformed to digital. I guess basically is what we're saying. So humans will lean over desks and keyboards and put devices on our heads in order to communicate. Tech doesn't do the same. Tech doesn't lean towards the human too much and go, right, how can I envelop everything that you are in order to help? It's the human that very often leans in and changes and alters, which means that it's not capturing, the same way as a car, right? We need to, if I'm to drive from here to your house, I can't take the straight line across across the hills of Stamford to do it. I need to conform to the roads, which is good because I'll get there faster, but also, it means that because the roads are there aren't as many trees. So there's always these like trade-offs. And I think what we're really coming down to is like, there is nothing that can make up for the sheer, however many millions, billions of years of human experience and chemical bio learning that all of us have had, of how to do communication, that is ever going to be picked up fully. Do you think fully by digital comms, though they certainly have their place? Zoom, Eric from Zoom, the founder of Zoom, says he doesn't want to sit on Zoom for the rest of his life, right? So I think there's a pretty good example of that. Kind of, I guess my final question is, do you think that companies that do hybrid, they mix remote and in-person, are they going to outperform others? Is it going to be different for every company? Are the all remote companies going to outperform others? Who's going to outperform who?
I think it'll be whoever can give the most context. And if you have a really rich in-person scenario, 100% in person, maybe that is the ultimate in context, but you're going to lose a lot of talent because people aren't going to want to do that. If you can build it at a remote company and say, we do offsites every 3 months, we are very clear. And you're saying my big thing is that I think you need to spell out the etiquette, spell out the rules, spell out how we interact, so that we can give more context, right? This is all about giving you the context to read my digital signals. And then hybrid might end up being the best opportunity because you have both quality and quantity. You get a little from being in person. And so for me, it's that context, so that you can read each other, so that you can use digital empathy. So you can say, I know you, and now we're going to ship that product. What happened in the end? We got an investor reference. Anyways, I think that's the key to winning, to be able to work better together. And it can go any way, but you can't do it by accident. It happens because management is saying, I want you to work better together.
And on that, the last question that's come in from anonymous attendee again is, if you are to codify that, what tools, software would you use to onboard new employees remotely? So
I'm sure everyone, from what I understand of the type of attendees, you've seen the HubSpot Culture Manifesto Playbook. I think a culture playbook and saying the expected, accepted behaviors. And I think really that means spelling it out for whether it's Slack, Teams, email. What's an SLA on email? Is Slack asynchronous? What does good feedback look like? We haven't talked at all about feedback, but feedback is a huge part of an issue in remote work. And how do you give effective feedback? So that people know the benchmarks, and then you adhere to them, or you ask people to change them. And then my favorite thing is to ask new employees to go back 3 months later and edit the playbook, because you write it once. It's a huge process. And does it hold true? Do they go, actually, you guys, you say Slack is asynchronous, but the expectation seems to be that I reply right away. So here's a mismatch. I think that is the most helpful. And then also I think and Dan, it's a fortnight thing. We can call it the fortnight thing. Maybe we've just coined a term. It's that office hours type thing. Let's do our work together with our headsets on.
Yeah.
And feel like we're together.
McKenna, this has been amazing. I've learned a lot. Thank you for sharing your insights. Where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so McKennaSweazey.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, and it's Sweazey's pretty easy to Google, but anyways, Sweazey, which is confusing for people. And also my book is called How to Win Friends and Manage Remotely, and it is available from all exciting bookstores like Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, indie sellers, etc.
All hybrid bookstores, in person and online.
Exactly. Hybrid. It's a hybrid bookstore experience.
Great. Perfect. McKenna, thank you for being amazing today. I really enjoyed this. Keep in touch. This recording will be made, this web stream will be made live, and the recording will be made available to those that sign up on email. Check out cadence.co to bring hybrid in a really meaningful, and in McKenna's words, contextual way to your workplaces and your teams. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, McKenna.